Thanks for coming back for another Starlink beta update. Today I wanted to show a little bit of kind of expand on the last video. So if you haven't watched that, go back and take a look at the redundant internet video where I showed setting up redundancy on between a Starlink beta and LTE connection. So this time we're going to use Velo Cloud. Just again as a disclaimer, I do work for VMware. I have access to some of the technology, but again, this is something that I'm not getting reimbursed for. I'm not getting paid for. I'm doing this because it's interesting to me and because I think this solves a lot of problems. So, no compensation for this, but I do have access to some technologies that the average consumer may not have access to. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. So, as always, thank you, and if you can like and subscribe, that always helps other people get the information. I'm not looking at this to make money. I'm looking at this as a way to help try to make the world a better place. And I really think this is a great solution. So quick agenda. Why, again, as always, the design. Demo is not going to be quite as interesting this time. I'm just going to show a little bit of kind of some of the interface on the Velo Cloud and show you some live monitoring because I think it's kind of cool. And I'll probably run some speed tests off of another box that you can actually see traffic in real time. And then we'll just kind of wrap up. So a little bit less content this time and a little bit more of me talking, but hopefully it's interesting. And again, always feel free to give me feedback on things that you find interesting that you'd like me to cover. So why? Why did we do this? So again, same graphic as the last time. We had a lot of drops. I was using Home Assistant at the time to monitor. I did break that, so I will be setting that back up after recording this video. I just broke the network connection because as usual, since it's a lab, I just took everything apart, and now I need to go back in there and probably reset the Home Assistant networking stack. So the irony of this is, the last time a friend of mine in the Midwest tweeted to my, when I put the video out, what, no Velo? And I know Michael, he's just giving me a bad time, but it was a fair point. It was a good point. He knew that I had a Velo Cloud box. He knew that I should definitely show this. So I thought, why not? Let's give more context, more interesting things, and then of course that led me down another rabbit hole that we'll talk about next. So first of all, I'm sorry, not next. First of all, we're going to show the design, and then I'll talk about it. And so this is really what the network looks like. If you'll notice from the last video, all I've done is I've swapped out the router and firewall with a Velo Cloud Edge 510. And for those of you that are not familiar, I'm not going to get into super big details on how Velo Cloud works, but essentially it's just bonding the two internet, so the Starlink and the cellular, and it handles the failover a bit more seamlessly. There is a firewall in there, of course. It's got a little wireless access point. I do not have the LTE version. I wish I did, but I consider myself very fortunate to have access to this technology, and I'm not going to go bug people when I already have a workable solution. If you had the LTE version of this, you wouldn't need the cellular broadband modem, but in my case, that's what I'm going to do. I did turn wireless on this box as well. It does have its own wireless, and I have Home Assistant hardwired in, which I will get back to fixing later, and I'll probably show some more stuff on using Home Assistant on Starlink. Still trying to come up with some use cases for, other than just the basic monitoring stuff and the traditional home automation. How could I integrate Home Assistant more into Starlink? I'm sure there's probably a lot smarter people on the team, so I might have to just put some things out there, and hopefully somebody will give me some ideas to test, or they'll come up with the ideas for me and go build it into the product. Again, if you haven't looked at Home Assistant, really cool project, and I've been having a lot of fun with that as well, but not specifically related to Starlink. So let's talk about some problems to solve for. And I actually try to throw a few solutions in here because, you don't want to just bring a bunch of problems. Sometimes it's nice to have some ideas on how you might solve them. So number one is remote access. And I've covered this in a previous video with the reverse VPN, which worked or wasn't a super ideal solution. It's probably the most secure solution that I could come up with. But then again, that does require that somewhere have a server running WireGuard or OpenVPN to connect to. So kind of that that remote access layer. So I can either pay somebody else to do that, or I can do it myself, or I was looking at Zero Tier 1. And I put the link in here. I'll try to post that in the description section. Super interesting project, open source for the most part, it looks like. And it's relatively, for home users, you can get up to 50 nodes on it. So theoretically, as long as you have a ton of devices that you need to access, you could just install this as long as it works. So looks like they have a Synology client. I have not tested that. They, of course, have Mac and Windows and Linux clients that I messed around with the Mac client a little bit. It's pretty interesting. It's also, it's a community plugin on Home Assistant, so I use that sometimes to test with Home Assistant. If, that's how I actually connect to my Home Assistant. It's behind Velo, or I'm sorry, it's behind Starlink when I'm actually using it. So pretty comfortable with it. I want to get a little deeper into that before I expose too many things over that. But it appears to be a good solution. And remote access for me becomes a problem because, I used to, when things are normal, I travel for work a little bit. So I do have, a media server and some other things I like to access, also remote troubleshooting, those types of things. And so for me, remote access is reasonably important. Although I do have some thoughts on how to work around that. I just need to kind of formalize that and see if there's a way that I can make that work. Dynamic DNS, and essentially because I have a dynamic IP from my internet provider, which in this case even more dynamic because it's using carrier grade NAT. And if you're not familiar with that, something good to read up on when you have a lot of time. It's essentially how cell phone providers and now Starlink are able to get so many people on the same network. And so the question becomes then, if I'm doing remote access a different way, like Zero Tier or reverse VPN, then does dynamic DNS matter, or do I just need to, whatever device I have, do I need to find a way just to, either have shortcuts or some form of DNS on the device, which then generates a whole bunch of other questions. So I haven't really thought this one through fully, and I don't have a good answer. So very curious. If you have comments on this, I would love to hear them. If you have ideas, I'm always open to those. But I'm thinking that remote access and dynamic DNS are kind of going to be similar problems to solve for. Zero Tier may help some of that, but I do need to do a little bit more digging. So far, I've just used it as an IP-based solution. And then one of the things I always like to think about is, so if I didn't work for VMware, if I didn't have access to Velo Cloud, how would I do this? And how could somebody who, how would your traditional average home user do something like this? Is this something, is there an open source technology that I could use? Is there a software solution? Which I know there's some VPN bonding solutions, but those do cost money. And so I always try to think about, is there something that is super simple? And when I say super simple, that a non-technical user could do, or at least maybe a less technical user. Of course, working in technology, I like to think I'm fairly technical, so I generally go for the deep tech solutions, or something that I can make work. But in this case, I really want to come up with something else. And so I'm going to actually do some more testing, and hopefully in the next video or so, I'm actually going to see if I can make it work with the EdgeRouter X that I used in the previous video. I want to see if I were to use, a load balance model of like, say 90% on Starlink and 10% on T-Mobile. Would that make the failover seamless? And that becomes very important. And in fact, let's go ahead and move into the demo. So that becomes very important because I need to actually be able to, make a phone call, have a video call, whatever, for work, basically every day. And so does my wife, and of course my son's in school, so they're going to need that level of access and failover. So we tested this. I tested this with Corey from a previous video, Corey Lyons, and we were able to make a video call, and we had a couple of glitches, but it was very much acceptable. It was much better than most people's internet connection just using Starlink and an LT connection. So now I need to think about how can I do that as in a more of a consumer type model. So one thing I want to point out, if you look down here, it does say Google Fi as the IP. I know this, we already looked this up. We double checked. This is a Starlink IP address, so it's something that we're going to work on with the VMware product team, and I'm not sure if it's just not updating correctly or if there's actually the database that VeloCloud uses to look these up is off or something. So we'll figure that out later. Not super concerned about that, but interesting to note. So I'm going to go ahead and start live monitoring, and so I'll show you a couple of things actually here. So let's start with, so this is my VeloCloud box, or it's my works. This is connected to a shared orchestrator that is managed by our Office of the CTO. So I'm not going to show you too much, but I do want to show some of these things. So in the past 60 minutes, I've been doing some video calls. I've been playing a little bit of World of Warcraft on this just to see what would happen. And so the max quality score here, as you can see, is so it goes between 0 and 10. So we're at a 752, which is not bad when you consider that the the Starlink is at 376 and the T-Mobile is at 523. And you'll notice we've actually had some drops where we just lost connection on Starlink completely. But as I was doing this, some of those drops occurred while I was actually on a video call prior to this. And so there was no outage. Sometimes the voice would get a little bit glitchy. So let's take a look at the video though, because that's really the one where it's super critical. So you'll see we had a lot of red here, and that just means that you're getting critical latency or packet loss or jitter. We did have even a little bit of an outage a couple of times, but I was still able to keep the video going. Actually, audio seemed to suffer more than video for some reason. And if we look at transactional, and by the way, I'm no VeloCloud expert. I'm more of on the consumer side of that, but just thought this was interesting. So just browsing the internet, I mean, the scores are great. We did have some drops, but T-Mobile was able to pick up for those, so no real issues. So that's the first thing I wanted to show. So now I'm going to start live monitoring, and I'm actually going to show TCP and UDP details. We're going to go with average throughput as my metric that I want to look at. And so if you'll notice, on the left side here, we have T-Mobile. So it looks like we may actually be going primarily through T-Mobile right now. We're not sending a lot of traffic at the moment, so it's not super important. And then on the right side, we have Starlink. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I have another device connected to the same wireless. So I'm going to go ahead and run a speed test just so we can get some data flowing. Let's see what that does. So we're currently running a speed test, and I'm going to bet you that we are. Okay, based on the speed, I would have thought that we would be on T-Mobile, but it looks like we may have switched in the middle. So you can see where I start the speed test here. But then it appears mid-speed test to fail over to Starlink. I'm not getting great speeds for some reason. Earlier I was getting upwards of 150 or more. So I don't know what's going on. Sometimes that's just how it works. So let's see if we can push a little bit more. So now I'm letting it run an upload test, and I'm actually going to go ahead and take up a second speed test using a different one. So the first one I used was fast.com just to see what would happen. So it looks like we actually sent the upstream packets through T-Mobile. So now I'm going to go ahead and use speedtest.net. So it's showing me that I am using a VeloCloud IP address. So it's interesting that it's giving a different IP than this one. I'm actually getting a 104 IP, but we're still not getting great performance. We're getting in the 50 meg range, which is perfectly acceptable for most of the things that I'm doing here for work. I can easily make a video call. I tested this, and we'll record some of these demonstrations with some of this data as well. I tested with FaceTime. Looks like FaceTime is a lot, uses a lot more bandwidth than does Google Meets. So we tested with both just to kind of see what would happen, and we'll do some more recordings of those. So I'm going to go ahead and push one more speed test through just so you get a little bit more data. And this is actually even more interesting to monitor when you're in the middle of a live video call, because you start to see these things. You can actually tell oh, we actually had a failover here, but we didn't really lose much, or we might have dropped, just enough packets to where it was a little hard to hear, but it wasn't bad. Okay, so speed's getting a little faster. But again, this is going through satellite. Latency is very much acceptable. It's like it's a little higher now. I think I'm at 48 according to speed test, but I'm getting 76.5 down and almost 14 up. So one more speed test through fast.com, and then we're going to go ahead and kind of wrap things up. So this one, not getting nearly as much. It looks like it's probably going through T-Mobile. So it's a little bit slower connection, which is fine. But I would still be able to maintain a video voice call. It just might, get a little pixelated. So that's kind of really all there is to show. Setting this up. Let's go back here and talk a little bit more. So setting this up as we wrap up. So all I did to set this up was I plugged in my VeloCloud box. My VeloCloud administrator sent me a link. I plugged the code in, an activation code, set up my password, set up my wireless, and then I plugged in my two networks, my two internet service providers, Starlink and the T-Mobile, and it worked great. No problems, no complaints. Super simple. So I'm going to call this a viable solution at this point. I'm going to say Starlink alone might be a little bit not quite there for a complete solution for home internet. However, if it's all you have, it's better than nothing. But if you can get a cellular backup, and if you happen to have access to VeloCloud, I think it's amazing. It's better than a lot of business solutions that I've worked on before, so I'm very impressed. There are some challenges, so remote access, dynamic DNS, those are going to be a problem. If those are not things that you're concerned about, then don't worry about them. Those are things that people like me tend to spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to figure out solutions for. So, so your mileage may vary. You just kind of have to decide. And then the last thing, and probably in my opinion, the most critical, is going to be we need to find a way to make this work for more home users. So my intent is hopefully to put something together for the VMware user group, since this is a VMware VeloCloud box, and for some other kind of a presentation to kind of showcase some of this and show some of the power of VeloCloud. But what I'd also like to do is do more of a community type session, and I don't even know if it would be just on YouTube or what, but kind of show some of this. So that people can understand this is how, this is how the average user might consume this. Because I think it's great. I love VMware VeloCloud, but not everybody's going to have access to those. So how do we make this a real world solution for more and more people? And that's something that I think is we're going to have to solve for as an industry. And I really honestly hope that this puts terrestrial internet providers, such as Comcast and Frontier and others, really makes them step up their game, because I think that they have not invested in their networks as well as they could have. I know that it's expensive, but I also know that that's part of being a service provider, and I really hope that this changes things. I know there's still a lot of challenges around satellite internet, around Starlink, the things that Amazon's doing, but I truly believe that this is going to be great for so many people living in rural areas, and even for people living in metropolitan areas. I think this can offer more options, and I'm very excited about this. So, as always, thanks again for watching. Really appreciate it, and if you could subscribe and like, so other people can can find this. It just helps me out, and again, not making any money off this, just trying to get the word out there. Also, if you can share this, if you have comments, throw them in the comments. Just keep it nice. I'm just doing this on my spare time, which as most of you know, most of us don't have a lot of spare time. So just be respectful of each other. And if you have thoughts, things you want me to test, or more questions, I love to interact with people. I try to get into all the Starlink groups on Facebook, and and post there as well to try to give people more ideas and help people adopt these types of technologies. So thanks, and I will see you in the next video.